The fluorescent lights of the free clinic's waiting room buzzed overhead like a countdown to Lee Ji-hoon's complete unraveling. At 25, he'd carefully constructed a life of brutal independence, working 2 jobs, avoiding entanglements, and absolutely never making the kind of reckless mistake that would require sitting in a plastic chair, clutching a positive pregnancy test. 3 weeks ago, drowning in the anniversary of losses he couldn't name, he'd sought oblivion in the anonymous heat of an upscale club's VIP room. The alpha had been devastating, all cedar and rain and commanding hands, but the arrangement was clear. One night, no names, gone by dawn. Ji-hoon had stumbled home believing he'd buried that moment of weakness. The medical coordinator, a kind-eyed beta woman, gently explained his options, her voice low and professional. But Ji-hoon barely heard her over the roaring in his ears. This wasn't supposed to be possible. He'd been careful. He had a plan. Terminate quietly, disappear from the city if necessary, protect the fragile stability he'd built from nothing. He gripped the paperwork with trembling fingers, his signature halfway complete, when the clinic's glass entrance doors exploded inward. Standing in the shower of glittering debris was Kang Min-ho, CEO of KG Group, the face of every financial magazine, the alpha supposedly cursed with permanent infertility, and the same man whose scent still haunted Ji-hoon's sheets. Minho's steel-gray eyes locked onto him with the precision of a predator who'd finally cornered his prey. "You," the alpha stated, his voice cutting through the chaos with terrifying finality, "are carrying my heir. You are not going anywhere." Ji-hoon understood in that crystalline moment. This was no longer about a one-night mistake. This was about survival against an alpha who'd just found the one thing he'd been told he could never have, and who would destroy anything, including Ji-hoon's freedom, to keep it. The nausea hit Ji-hoon at exactly 6:47 a.m. on a Tuesday, 3 minutes before his alarm was set to go off. He barely made it to the bathroom before his body violently rejected the cheap instant noodles from the night before. Crouched on the cold tile floor of his shoebox apartment, he pressed his forehead against the porcelain and tried to convince himself it was food poisoning. Stress. Exhaustion from pulling double shifts at the convenience store and the tutoring center. Anything except the possibility that had been clawing at the edges of his consciousness for the past 2 weeks. By Thursday, he'd stopped lying to himself. The drugstore pregnancy test sat on his bathroom counter like a small bomb, the 2 pink lines stark and undeniable against the white plastic. 6 weeks. It had been exactly 6 weeks since that night, since he'd lost himself in the arms of a stranger whose face he'd deliberately tried not to memorize, whose name he'd never asked for, whose touch had felt like both salvation and damnation. Ji-hoon's hands shook as he researched clinics on his phone, scrolling through pages with clinical descriptions of procedures and costs. The escort service's confidentiality agreement had been ironclad. No contact information exchanged, no identifying details shared, complete anonymity guaranteed. The alpha was a ghost, a memory, a mistake that Ji-hoon would handle alone, the same way he'd handled everything else in his life since he was 17. He scheduled an appointment for the following Monday, used the last of his emergency savings for the deposit, and told himself he was taking control of the situation. He told himself he was fine. The knock on his door came on Sunday evening. Ji-hoon wasn't expecting anyone. He never had visitors. His cramped studio on the 5th floor of a building that had seen better decades wasn't the kind of place people came to socially. Through the peephole, he saw a man in an expensive suit, too expensive for this neighborhood, holding a tablet and wearing the expression of someone conducting unpleasant business. "Lee Ji-hoon?" The man asked the moment Ji-hoon cracked open the door, chain still attached. Every instinct screamed at him to slam it shut. "Who's asking?" "I represent a client who requires urgent confirmation of a delicate matter." The man's eyes flicked meaningfully to Ji-hoon's midsection. "May I come in?" "No." Ji-hoon's heart hammered against his ribs. "I don't know what you're talking about. You have the wrong person." The night of October 7th. The Opal Room at Club Elysium. VIP section. The man's voice was flat, factual, devastating. "My client has been monitoring certain developments. He knows about your condition. He's on his way here now." The chain felt flimsy as tissue paper. "That's impossible. The service guaranteed. The service guaranteed anonymity from you." The man's smile was thin and professional. "My client paid for significantly more comprehensive terms. I'd suggest you prepare yourself. CEO Kang doesn't appreciate being kept waiting." Ji-hoon's blood turned to ice. "Kang." There was only one Kang powerful enough to unravel an elite escort service's confidentiality like it was nothing. Only one CEO whose reach could extend into every corner of the city, who could track down a nobody Omega in a forgotten building and… The elevator dinged. Heavy footsteps echoed down the hallway, measured and inevitable. Ji-hoon watched through the gap in his door as Kang Min-ho materialized from the shadows like a figure from a nightmare. He looked exactly as he had in that club, devastatingly handsome, cold as winter steel, radiating the kind of power that made the cramped hallway feel even smaller. But now, in the harsh fluorescent lighting, Ji-hoon could see the barely controlled fury in those gray eyes. Minho stopped 3 feet from the door. "Open it." "I don't. I know you're pregnant." The alpha's voice was quiet, controlled, absolutely merciless. "I know it's mine. And I know that's medically impossible." He stepped closer, and Ji-hoon could smell that scent again. Cedar and rain and something darker underneath. "So you're going to let me inside, and you're going to explain how you're carrying a child I was told I could never have. Or I will remove this door and every obstacle between us. Choose quickly." Ji-hoon's fingers trembled on the chain. He'd thought the biggest mistake was that night 6 weeks ago. He was wrong. The biggest mistake was believing he could ever escape it. The private medical clinic Minho had driven them to was nothing like the free health center Ji-hoon had planned to visit. Everything was marble and hushed voices, the kind of place where discretion cost more than Ji-hoon made in 6 months. The doctor, a distinguished older beta woman, had confirmed what they both already knew with the kind of detached professionalism that came from treating the ultra-wealthy. Yes, the Omega was approximately 7 weeks pregnant. Yes, all preliminary indicators suggested a healthy, viable pregnancy. And yes, given the Alpha's medical history, this was statistically extraordinary. Minho had said nothing during the examination, standing by the window with his back rigid and his hands clasped behind him like a general surveying a battlefield. But Ji-hoon had watched the Alpha's reflection in the darkened glass, had seen the way his jaw tightened when the doctor said viable, the way his fingers clenched when she mentioned healthy. This wasn't just a pregnancy to him. This was vindication. Proof. A miracle wrapped in flesh and blood that Minho would never, ever let slip away. The car ride to Minho's office was silent. Ji-hoon sat pressed against the door, his mind racing through scenarios that all ended the same way, trapped. When they arrived at the top floor of the KG Group headquarters, a tower of glass and steel that looked down on the city like a throne, Minho finally spoke. "Sit." Ji-hoon sat. The chair was leather, expensive, and felt like a witness stand. Minho slid a document across the desk, easily 30 pages thick, bound in black. "This is non-negotiable. Read it, but understand that the outcome is already decided. You can't just…" "I can." Minho's voice was flat, factual. "You will move into my penthouse effective immediately. You will receive full medical care, financial support, and anything required for a healthy pregnancy. You will carry this child to term. After the birth, we will discuss custody arrangements." He leaned back, those steel-gray eyes pinning Ji-hoon in place. "In exchange, your debts will be cleared. Your sister's university tuition will be paid in full for all 4 years. You will want for nothing." Ji-hoon's throat closed. "And if I refuse? Then I will ensure every door in this city closes to you. Every job, every opportunity, every escape route." Minho said it without heat, without malice, just cold certainty. "I have spent 15 years building an empire while being told I was fundamentally broken. That I would never have an heir, never continue my family line, never be whole. And now you…" His control cracked for just a moment, something raw and desperate flashing across his features. "You are carrying the impossible. My child. The only one I will ever have. So no, Ji-hoon, you cannot refuse. You can sign this contract and accept my protection, or you can fight me and lose everything. But that child stays with me. Choose." The contract felt heavy in Ji-hoon's hands. He scanned the pages: medical care, living arrangements, financial compensation, strict confidentiality clauses. It was phrased in the language of mutual agreement, of generous terms and fair exchange. But buried in the legalese was the truth. He was signing away his freedom for 9 months, maybe longer, to an alpha who saw him as nothing more than a vessel for a miracle he'd been denied. Ji-hoon thought about his sister's tuition bills, his mounting debts, the cramped studio apartment with its broken heating and thin walls. He thought about trying to raise a child alone, about Minho's resources hunting him across every corner of the country. He signed. The penthouse was a cage made of floor-to-ceiling windows and designer furniture. 60 floors above the city, it was breathtaking and isolating in equal measure. Minho showed him to a bedroom, not the master suite, Ji-hoon noted with bitter relief. That was larger than his entire former apartment. Everything was cold grays and whites, sterile and perfect, like a luxury hotel where no one actually lived. "The staff will bring your belongings tomorrow," Minho said from the doorway. "I've arranged for a private obstetrician to visit twice weekly. You are not to leave without security. You are not to contact anyone without clearance." He paused, and something almost like concern crossed his face. "This is for your protection. And the child's." Then he left, and Ji-hoon stood alone in his beautiful prison, watching the city lights blur through tears he refused to let fall. The first week in the penthouse, Ji-hoon counted the hours. The second week, he stopped counting and started wandering the sterile rooms like a ghost, looking for something. Anything that suggested an actual human being lived here. He found nothing. No photos, no personal items, no clutter or warmth. Just expensive furniture arranged with surgical precision and a kitchen so pristine it looked like it had never been used. Minho was barely present. He left before dawn and returned after midnight, communicating through his assistant about meal schedules and medical appointments. When they did cross paths, the alpha treated him with the distant courtesy of a hotel manager checking on a long-term guest. Professional. Detached. Completely impersonal. Ji-hoon told himself he preferred it this way. Told himself the loneliness was better than the suffocating intensity of Minho's attention. He was lying. The morning sickness hit in the third week with a vengeance that left him curled on the marble bathroom floor at 3 a.m., too weak to make it back to bed. He'd been sick before, had managed it quietly in his cramped studio, but here the retching echoed off the expensive tile and made him feel even more pathetic. He pressed his cheek against the cold floor and waited for the nausea to pass, for his body to stop rebelling against the impossible situation he'd trapped it in. He didn't hear the door open. Didn't realize Minho was there until a warm hand pressed against his forehead, testing for fever with the kind of careful precision that made Ji-hoon's breath catch. "How long has this been happening?" Minho's voice was low, stripped of its usual commanding edge. "It's normal," Ji-hoon managed, trying to pull away. "The doctor said." "I know what the doctor said." The alpha's hands were already moving, one supporting Ji-hoon's shoulder, the other reaching for a towel. "Can you stand?" Ji-hoon wanted to refuse, to maintain some shred of dignity, but another wave of nausea made the decision for him. He let Minho help him up, let the alpha guide him to the sink with a gentleness that seemed completely at odds with the cold CEO who'd blackmailed him into this gilded cage. Minho handed him water, waited while he rinsed his mouth, then, impossibly, swept him up and carried him back to bed. "I can walk," Ji-hoon protested weakly. "You're shaking." Minho set him down on the mattress with surprising care, adjusting the pillows behind him like he'd done this before. Like he knew how. The doctor recommended ginger tea for nausea. "I'll make some." "You don't have to." But Minho was already gone, and Ji-hoon was too exhausted to process the strangeness of an alpha worth billions personally making him tea at 3 in the morning. When Minho returned, he sat in the chair beside the bed instead of leaving, watching Ji-hoon sip the tea with an intensity that should have been uncomfortable, but somehow wasn't. The silence stretched between them, different from the cold distance of before. More fragile. More human. "I had a brother," Minho said suddenly, his gaze fixed on the darkened windows. "Younger. He died when I was 16. Rare genetic condition." His fingers tightened on the armrest. "The same condition that left me infertile. The doctors told my father I was a medical dead end. Broken genetics that should never be passed on, even if I somehow could." Ji-hoon's throat tightened. "Minho, I built KG Group to prove I wasn't broken. That I could create something lasting even if I couldn't create life." The alpha's laugh was bitter, hollow. 15 years of trying to fill a void. "And then you." His eyes finally met Ji-hoon's, and there was something raw there, something desperate and aching. "You're carrying what I was told was impossible. What every specialist, every test, every probability said would never exist. So yes, I'm keeping you here. Yes, I'm controlling every variable I can. Because if I lose this, if I lose you both." He didn't finish. Didn't need to. Ji-hoon set down the tea with trembling hands. "I had a brother too," he whispered. "Older. He died protecting me from our father's debts. I was 17. He looked at Minho, really looked at him, and saw not the ruthless CEO, but someone equally haunted, equally desperate to protect what little they had left. I'm not going to run. I can't. But I need you to stop treating me like I'm just a vessel. Like I'm nothing but what I'm carrying. Minho was quiet for a long moment. Then slowly, he reached out and took Ji-hoon's hand. The touch was careful, questioning, achingly gentle. I don't know how to do this, the alpha admitted. Any of this. Ji-hoon's fingers curled around his. Neither do I. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't trust. But it was the first crack in the ice, and something real underneath. The ultrasound appointment fell on a Thursday morning, exactly 10 weeks into the pregnancy. Ji-hoon had been to 2 previous checkups, both routine and unremarkable, with Minho sitting in the corner of the examination room like a silent sentinel. The alpha never asked questions, never showed emotion, just absorbed every word the doctor said with the focus of someone memorizing battle plans. But today felt different. Minho had canceled his morning meetings, something his assistant had mentioned with barely concealed shock, and drove them to the clinic himself rather than sending a car. His hands were tight on the steering wheel, his jaw set in a way that Ji-hoon had learned meant the alpha was fighting to maintain control. Dr. Yoon greeted them with her usual warm professionalism, guiding Ji-hoon onto the examination table while explaining that today's scan would be more detailed. We should be able to hear the heartbeat clearly now, she said, squeezing the cold gel onto his still flat stomach. This is often the appointment where things feel more real for parents. Ji-hoon caught Minho's slight flinch at the word parents. But the alpha said nothing, moving closer to the monitor with the intensity of a man approaching a verdict. The wand pressed against Ji-hoon's abdomen, and Dr. Yoon adjusted the angle, her eyes on the screen. Static filled the room, crackling and formless. Then, cutting through the white noise like a drumbeat, came the sound. Thump-thump, thump-thump, thump-thump. Fast and strong and impossibly, devastatingly real. Ji-hoon's breath caught. He'd known intellectually that he was pregnant, had seen the test results and felt the nausea, and lived in Minho's controlled environment for weeks. But hearing that rapid, determined rhythm, made everything crystallize into terrifying clarity. There was a life inside him. A person. Someone who didn't ask to be created from a desperate mistake and an alpha's miracle. He turned to look at Minho and felt his heart stop. The alpha's face had completely shattered. All the careful control, the cold CEO mask, the ruthless businessman who'd blackmailed Ji-hoon into this situation, gone. Minho's hand was pressed against his mouth, his eyes locked on the monitor with an expression of such raw, unguarded devastation that Ji-hoon felt like he was witnessing something sacred. Something private. Tears tracked silently down Minho's face. That's, Minho's voice cracked failed. He tried again. That's my child. Yes, Dr. Yoon said softly, her professional demeanor gentling. Strong heartbeat. Perfectly healthy. Everything looks excellent. Minho reached out, his hand hovering over Ji-hoon's stomach like he was afraid to touch, afraid to break the spell. May I? Ji-hoon nodded, unable to speak past the sudden tightness in his throat. The alpha's palm settled against the gel-slick skin with infinite care, his fingers trembling. I can feel it, he whispered. The rhythm. He broke off, closing his eyes, and Ji-hoon watched this powerful man who commanded billions come completely undone over a heartbeat only technology could detect. Dr. Yoon excused herself quietly, giving them privacy Ji-hoon hadn't known he needed. They told me when I was 18, Minho said, his voice barely audible. After my brother died, they ran every test. Found the same genetic markers. The specialists were very clear. My sperm count was catastrophically low, motility nearly zero, and what little I had carried the same fatal condition that killed him. His thumb moved in small circles against Ji-hoon's skin, unconscious and tender. They said natural conception was impossible. That even with intervention, my chances were functionally zero. That I should accept I would never have biological children. Minho. I built everything to compensate for that. The alpha's eyes opened, meeting Ji-hoon's with an intensity that stole his breath. Every acquisition, every success, every billion won. It was all trying to prove I wasn't the genetic failure they said I was. That I could create something that mattered, even if I couldn't create life. His hand pressed more firmly against Ji-hoon's stomach. And then you walked into that club, and I felt something I'd never felt before. Not just attraction. Not just desire. Something that made me track you down, made me investigate when I should have let it go, made me. Obsessed, Ji-hoon finished quietly. Desperate, Minho corrected. When I found out you were pregnant, I thought it was a mistake. A lie. Something impossible that would be taken away the moment I reached for it, like everything else I'd ever wanted. His voice dropped to a whisper. But that's my child's heartbeat. That's real. You're real. And I don't know how to do this without controlling every variable because I'm terrified that if I stop, if I let go for 1 second, this miracle will disappear. Ji-hoon reached up slowly, his hand covering Minho's where it rested on his stomach. I'm not disappearing, he said, and meant it. But you need to stop treating this like a hostile takeover. This isn't your empire. This is a child. Our child. Minho's fingers laced through his, holding on like Ji-hoon was the only solid thing in a collapsing world. Teach me how, the alpha breathed. Please. The news broke on a Monday morning while Ji-hoon was attempting to keep down dry toast and ginger tea. Minho's phone had been ringing nonstop since dawn, the alpha pacing the length of the penthouse with a tension that made the air feel electric and dangerous. Ji-hoon caught fragments of conversations, hostile takeover, board meeting, leaked information, before Minho finally ended the call and turned to face him with eyes like winter storms. Hanseong Industries is making a move, Minho said, his voice carefully controlled in a way that meant he was furious. They've been buying up shares quietly for months. They're calling an emergency shareholders meeting to challenge my leadership. Ji-hoon set down his tea with trembling hands. Can they do that? They're arguing that I've become erratic. Unfocused. Minho's jaw tightened. That my sudden interest in personal matters, his gaze flickered to Ji-hoon's stomach, indicates I'm no longer fit to run KG Group. The implications settled like ice in Ji-hoon's chest. Someone had been watching. Someone knew about the pregnancy, about him, about the miracle Minho had been so desperate to protect. How did they find out? I don't know yet. The alpha's phone buzzed again, but he ignored it. But I will. And when I do, the threat hung unfinished in the air, sharp and violent. The attacks escalated over the next 3 days. Business publications ran speculation pieces about Minho's distraction. Anonymous sources claimed the CEO was making irrational decisions. Hanseong's legal team filed motion after motion, each one designed to destabilize KG Group's foundations. Minho barely slept, leaving the penthouse before dawn and returning after midnight, his suits progressively more rumpled, his control fraying at the edges. Ji-hoon felt like a liability, a weakness. The exact thing Minho's enemies needed to tear down everything he'd built. The envelope arrived on Thursday, slipped under the penthouse door while the security team was changing shifts. Ji-hoon found it during one of his restless wanderings, his name written across the front in careful block letters. Inside was a single photograph, taken from a distance, grainy but unmistakable. Him, leaving the medical clinic 3 days ago, Minho's hand protective on his lower back. The note was brief. Withdraw your support for Kang, or the world learns about his omega whore and bastard heir. Ji-hoon's hands shook so badly he nearly dropped it. The threat wasn't just about exposing the pregnancy. It was about destroying him, painting him as a gold digger, a manipulator, someone who'd trapped an infertile alpha with an impossible child. The media would eviscerate them both. He heard the penthouse door open, Minho's footsteps in the entryway. Ji-hoon met him in the living room, holding out the envelope with fingers that wouldn't stop trembling. Minho read it once. Twice. Then his face went absolutely empty. Pack a bag, the alpha said, his voice terrifyingly calm. We're moving you to a secure location. Now. Minho, I can't just. They threatened you. Minho's control finally cracked, his alpha presence flooding the room with such intensity that Ji-hoon's instincts screamed at him to submit, to duck his head and bare his throat. They threatened our child. That means they've already lost, they just don't know it yet. What happened next, Ji-hoon only learned about later in pieces. Minho's security team tracked the envelope to a Hanseong executive within 2 hours. By midnight, that executive had been arrested for blackmail and corporate espionage, his communications records seized. By dawn, Minho had called in every favor, leveraged every alliance, and systematically dismantled Hanseong's hostile takeover attempt with the precision of a surgeon and the ruthlessness of a warlord. The rival company's stock plummeted. Their board fractured. Their CEO resigned in disgrace. Minho didn't just win. He annihilated them. Ji-hoon watched it unfold from the secure location. A private estate an hour outside the city, surrounded by security that made the penthouse look unguarded. He watched Minho on the news, cold and controlled and absolutely merciless, and felt something twist in his chest. This was the alpha who'd blackmailed him, who'd trapped him in a gilded cage. This was the ruthless CEO who destroyed anyone who threatened what was his. But when Minho finally arrived at the estate 3 days later, exhaustion carved into every line of his face. The first thing he did was cross the room and pull Ji-hoon into his arms with a desperation that had nothing to do with possession and everything to do with terror. "I thought I'd lose you," Minho whispered against his hair. "I thought they'd." "I'm here," Ji-hoon said, his hands fisting in the alpha's shirt. "We're both here. We're safe." Minho's arms tightened, and Ji-hoon finally understood. The ruthlessness wasn't about control. It was about protection. About an alpha who'd lost too much already and would burn the world down rather than lose the impossible miracle he'd been given. It should have terrified him. Instead, for the first time since signing that contract, Ji-hoon felt genuinely safe. The estate had a garden that Ji-hoon discovered in his second week of isolation. A carefully manicured space with stone paths and winter-bare trees that at least gave the illusion of freedom. He was walking there when Minho found him, the alpha's presence announced by the crunch of gravel under expensive shoes. "The threat's been neutralized," Minho said without preamble. "We can return to the city tomorrow if you'd like." Ji-hoon didn't turn around, his hand resting unconsciously on the small swell of his stomach. 16 weeks now, barely showing but undeniably there. "And then what?" "Then you'll be more comfortable. The penthouse has better medical facilities nearby, and—" "I mean after." Ji-hoon finally faced him, and something in his expression made Minho stop mid-sentence. "After the birth. After your miracle arrives and you have your heir. What happens to me?" Minho's jaw tightened. "That's outlined in the contract. We'll discuss custody arrangements." "I don't want to hear about the fucking contract," Ji-hoon snapped, surprised by his own vehemence. "I want to hear what you want. Not CEO Kang with his lawyers and contingency plans. You, Minho, the man who cried hearing our baby's heartbeat. The man who destroyed an entire company because they threatened us. What do you want?" The alpha looked thrown, like Ji-hoon had asked him to solve an equation in a language he didn't speak. "I want the child to be safe. Healthy. I want to provide. That's not what I asked." Ji-hoon stepped closer, his frustration boiling over after weeks of careful distance. "Do you want me? Or am I just the incubator who happened to give you what you thought you'd never have? Because I need to know, Minho. I need to know if I'm building something here, or if I'm just count down to the day you take the baby and pay me off like a business transaction." Minho's control visibly fractured. "It's not that simple." "It is exactly that simple. Do you want me? Yes or no?" "I don't." Minho's hands clenched into fists at his sides. "I don't know how to answer that." The admission hit like a physical blow. Ji-hoon felt something crack in his chest. All the fragile hope he'd been building since that night when Minho held his hand crumbling to dust. "Right. Of course. You're not just anything," Minho interrupted, his voice raw. "That's the problem. You were supposed to be simple. A one-night mistake I could compartmentalize and forget. Then you were supposed to be a contract. A transaction I could control with money and lawyers and careful planning." He took a shaking breath. "But you keep being more, and I don't know what to do with that because I've spent my entire adult life learning how to want things I can acquire. Companies, properties, success, control. Things I can strategize and take and own." "I'm not a thing to own," Ji-hoon said quietly. "I know." Minho's composure finally shattered completely, his voice breaking. "I know you're not, and that terrifies me because I don't know how to want a person. I don't know how to need someone without destroying them or driving them away. My brother died because of genetics I share. My parents couldn't look at me the same way after. Every relationship I've had has been transactional because that's all I know how to do. Exchange value for value, keep everything controlled and predictable." He ran a hand through his hair, the gesture achingly vulnerable. "And then you walked into that club and everything stopped being predictable. You got pregnant when that was impossible. You didn't run when I gave you every reason to. You sit with me at 3 a.m. making terrible jokes about baby names, and you look at me like I'm not broken and his voice dropped to a whisper. "I can't imagine you leaving. I can't imagine this penthouse without you wandering around criticizing my furniture. I can't imagine raising this child without you there to stop me from turning them into another controlled variable in my empire." Ji-hoon's throat tightened. "That's not the same as wanting me. Isn't it?" Minho's eyes met his, desperate and aching. "I don't know what love looks like if it's not this. This terror of losing you. This need to protect you even when you don't need protecting. This feeling like my chest is caving in when you ask if you're just temporary. He stepped closer, his hand reaching out to cup Ji-hoon's face with devastating gentleness. I don't have pretty words. I don't know how to be romantic or soft. But the thought of you walking away after the birth, of reducing you to scheduled custody visits and legal arrangements, makes me want to burn the world down. So if that's wanting you, then yes. God help us both, but yes. Ji-hoon leaned into the touch, his own hand covering Minho's. You're an idiot. I know. A controlling, emotionally constipated idiot who thinks destroying companies is easier than saying, I care about you. I know, Minho repeated, and there was almost a smile in his voice. I'm not leaving, Ji-hoon said firmly. But you need to work on the words, because our child deserves a father who can tell them they're loved without a legal team present. Minho pulled him close, pressing his forehead against Ji-hoon's. I'll try. I'm not good at this. I noticed. But Ji-hoon was smiling now, his arms wrapping around the alpha's waist. Lucky for you, I'm patient. Lucky for me, Minho echoed, and held him like he was the only solid thing in a spinning world. Ji-hoon had argued against attending the gala. At 7 months pregnant, he felt ungainly and obvious. The formal maternity suit Minho's stylist had procured doing little to disguise the prominent swell of his stomach. But Minho had been insistent, his hand possessive on Ji-hoon's lower back as they'd prepared to leave the penthouse. They need to see you, the alpha had said, adjusting Ji-hoon's collar with surprising tenderness. They need to understand that you're not a secret. Not anymore. Now, standing in the ballroom of Seoul's most prestigious hotel, surrounded by the city's elite and the entire KG Group board of directors, Ji-hoon understood what Minho had really meant. This was a declaration. A line drawn in expensive marble and champagne. Minho had introduced him simply, his voice carrying across the sudden hush. This is Lee Ji-hoon. My partner. The father of my child. No explanations. No justifications. Just fact, delivered with the same authority the alpha used to announce quarterly earnings. The reaction had been immediate, whispers rippling through the crowd like a shockwave. Ji-hoon felt every eye in the room cataloging him, dissecting him, measuring his worth against the CEO standing beside him. He'd kept his spine straight and his expression neutral, the way he'd learned to survive years of his father's creditors showing up at their door. For an hour, it had gone smoothly. Minho had kept Ji-hoon close, one hand always touching, his elbow, his back, his shoulder, a constant reminder that he wasn't alone in this. Board members had approached with careful courtesy, offering congratulations that ranged from genuine to performative. Ji-hoon had smiled and nodded and let Minho handle the conversations, focusing on not passing out from the exhaustion of carrying another human while standing in dress shoes. Then Director Choi approached, and everything went to hell. Choi was old money and older prejudices, a board member who'd opposed every progressive policy Minho had ever implemented. He'd smiled like a shark as he'd cut through the crowd, a tablet held prominently in his manicured hands. CEO Kang, how wonderful to finally meet your partner. Choi's pause before the word was deliberate, cutting. I must say, we were all quite surprised by the announcement, particularly given Mr. Lee's interesting professional history. Ji-hoon's blood turned to ice. Minho's hand tightened on his waist, a warning. I'm not sure what you're implying, Director Choi, Minho said, his voice dangerously soft. Oh, I think you are. Choi turned the tablet around, and Ji-hoon's worst nightmare materialized on the screen. Records from the escort service, his photo, his profile, dates and payments outlined in clinical detail. Mr. Lee was registered with elite companions for approximately 8 months. His specialty was listed as discreet encounters with high-profile clients. Quite the coincidence that he ended up pregnant with your child, isn't it? The ballroom had gone silent. Ji-hoon felt every eye turned toward them, felt the judgment and speculation crushing down like physical weight. His legs wavered, and only Minho's grip kept him upright. This is hardly appropriate, Minho started, but Choi cut him off. What's inappropriate is our CEO bringing a common prostitute to a corporate function and expecting us to accept this farce. Choi's voice rose, playing to the crowd. The board has been patient with your eccentricities, Kang, but this is beyond acceptable. You've compromised the company's reputation, your own credibility, and frankly your fitness to lead. He looked around the room, gathering support. I move for an immediate vote of no confidence. CEO Kang has demonstrated a catastrophic lapse in judgment that makes him morally unsuitable for his position. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Ji-hoon watched board members' faces, saw some nodding, others looking uncomfortable but not disagreeing. This was it. The moment Minho would have to choose. His empire or the Omega who'd trapped him with an impossible pregnancy. Ji-hoon stepped back, trying to extract himself from Minho's grip. "It's okay," he whispered. "You don't have to." Minho's arm locked around him like steel. "Don't move." Then the alpha turned to face the room, and Ji-hoon had never seen him look more dangerous. Not when destroying Hanseong Industries. Not when hunting down threats. This was different. This was personal. "You're right, Director Choi," Minho said, his voice carrying to every corner of the silent ballroom. "I have demonstrated a lapse in judgment. Several, in fact." He pulled Ji-hoon closer, deliberately, possessively. "I failed to realize sooner that the metrics I'd used to measure my worth, profit margins, acquisitions, board approval, were fundamentally meaningless. I wasted 15 years building an empire to prove I wasn't broken, when the only thing that was broken was my ability to see what actually mattered." He looked down at Ji-hoon, and something in his expression made Ji-hoon's breath catch. Yes, I met Ji-hoon through an escort service. Yes, he was desperate enough to take that work to save his family. And yes, I got him pregnant during what was supposed to be an anonymous encounter. But if you think any of that makes him less worthy of standing beside me, then you fundamentally misunderstand what strength looks like. Minho turned back to the board, his hand moving to rest protectively over Ji-hoon's pregnant stomach. "So here's my counter-proposal, Director Choi. You can have my resignation. Right now. I will walk away from KG Group, from this company I built from nothing, from every dollar and decision and deal I've made. Or," his voice dropped to something absolutely merciless, "you can accept that Lee Ji-hoon is my family, that this child is my heir, and that anyone who questions their place in my life or this company will find themselves on the outside looking in. Choose carefully, because I promise you, I will burn down everything I've built before I let you make Ji-hoon feel ashamed for surviving the only way he could." The silence was deafening. Ji-hoon felt tears burning behind his eyes, his hand covering Minho's where it rested on their child. Director Choi's face had gone purple. "You would choose a whore over your company?" "I would choose my family," Minho corrected, "over people who think net worth determines human value. Every single time." The silence following Minho's declaration stretched like a wire pulled too taut. Ji-hoon watched the board members exchange glances, saw the calculations happening behind their eyes. The cost of losing a CEO who'd tripled their stock value versus the scandal of accepting his pregnant Omega partner with a damning past. Director Choi looked ready to push further, his mouth opening for another attack. Then Director Park, the eldest board member and the one who'd been with the company since Minho's father's time, cleared her throat. "Director Choi, I believe you've said quite enough." Her voice was quiet but carried absolute authority. "CEO Kang has never made decisions that weren't in this company's best interest. If he says his family is non-negotiable, then it's non-negotiable." "But the scandal," Choi sputtered. "Will be managed," Park interrupted. "As all scandals are. What we cannot manage is losing a CEO who's proven his worth repeatedly." She looked around the room. "All those in favor of accepting CEO Kang's terms and moving forward?" Hands rose slowly, then more quickly. One by one, the board members chose survival over moral posturing. Director Choi stood alone in his opposition, his face twisted with impotent rage. "Then it's settled," Park said with finality. "Welcome to the KG Group family, Mr. Lee." But Ji-hoon barely heard the polite applause that followed. His entire focus was on Minho, on the way the alpha's hand trembled slightly where it rested against his stomach, on the careful control that had finally, completely shattered. Minho had just bet everything, his company, his reputation, 15 years of building an empire, on a broke Omega he'd met in a hotel room and an impossible child neither of them had planned. The rest of the gala passed in a blur. People approached to offer congratulations that now seemed genuine, if cautious. Minho accepted them with distant courtesy, but Ji-hoon could feel the tension vibrating through him, the way his grip never loosened, like he was afraid Ji-hoon would disappear if he let go. They left early, Minho citing Ji-hoon's exhaustion though they both knew it was an excuse. The car ride back to the penthouse was silent, charged with something Ji-hoon couldn't name. Minho's hand stayed locked with his, their fingers intertwined so tightly it almost hurt. Inside the penthouse, Minho finally released him, but only to pace the length of the living room like a caged animal. Ji-hoon watched him, his heart hammering against his ribs. "You didn't have to do that," Ji-hoon said quietly. Minho stopped, his back to him. Yes, I did. You could have lost everything. I already told you what losing everything looks like. Minho turned, and his face was raw, stripped of every defense. It looks like you walking away. It looks like raising this child alone, and knowing I chose a boardroom over the only people who ever made me feel like I was more than a broken alpha playing at being whole. He crossed the room in 3 strides, his hands framing Ji-hoon's face with devastating tenderness. I'm terrified, Minho whispered. I'm absolutely terrified because I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to be someone's partner without controlling them. I don't know how to be a father when my own father looked at me like I was defective. I don't know how to love someone without destroying it because every good thing in my life has been taken away. Minho, but I love you. The words came out broken, desperate. I love you and I don't know when it happened. Maybe that first night when you looked at me like I was just a man instead of a CEO. Maybe when you held my hand at 3 a.m. while you were sick. Maybe when you called me an emotionally constipated idiot and I realized you were right. I love you and it's terrifying because you could leave. You could take our child and go and I would deserve it after everything I've done, every way I've trapped you and controlled you and… Ji-hoon kissed him. It was graceless and desperate, his pregnant belly making it awkward, but he poured everything into it. Every lonely night in the penthouse, every moment of unexpected tenderness, every time Minho had chosen them over his careful control. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, Ji-hoon kept his forehead pressed against Minho's. I love you too, you idiot. I've been trying not to because you're controlling and arrogant, and you blackmailed me into living with you. But you also learned to make ginger tea at 3 a.m., and you cried hearing our baby's heartbeat, and you just offered to give up everything you've built rather than let someone make me feel ashamed. His hands fisted in Minho's jacket. So yes, I love you. And I'm not leaving. Not now, not after the baby comes, not ever. You're stuck with me. Minho's laugh was wet, his arms wrapping around Ji-hoon with desperate strength. I can live with that. Good. Ji-hoon pulled back enough to meet his eyes. Now say it again. The love part. Without the terrified breakdown. Minho's smile was tremulous but real. I love you, Lee Ji-hoon. Better. Ji-hoon kissed him again, softer this time. I love you too, Kang Min-ho. Even though you're a mess. Especially because you're a mess, Minho corrected, his hand moving to rest on their child. Our mess. And for the first time since that night in the hotel room, Ji-hoon felt like he'd finally come home. The contractions started at 2 a.m. on a Tuesday, 3 days before Ji-hoon's due date. He woke to a tightening sensation that stole his breath, his hand immediately reaching across the bed for Minho. The alpha was awake instantly, his eyes alert and terrified in the dim light. Is it? I think so, Ji-hoon gasped, and suddenly Minho was moving, all careful control replaced by barely contained panic. The CEO who commanded boardrooms with absolute authority couldn't figure out how to work the hospital bag zipper. The birth was everything the books hadn't prepared them for, endless and excruciating and overwhelming. Minho stayed beside him the entire time, letting Ji-hoon crush his hand during contractions, whispering encouragement that mostly consisted of, "You're doing so well," and "I love you," repeated like a mantra. When Ji-hoon screamed that he hated him, and this was all his fault, Minho had just pressed a kiss to his sweat-soaked forehead and agreed completely. 17 hours later, their son entered the world with a piercing cry that made Ji-hoon sob with relief and exhaustion. The doctor placed the baby on Ji-hoon's chest, and the world narrowed to this tiny, perfect creature with Minho's nose and a shock of dark hair. Ji-hoon touched the small hand, felt impossibly tiny fingers wrap around his, and felt something fundamental shift in his chest. This was real. This impossible, miraculous, beautiful child was theirs. He looked up to find Minho frozen beside the bed, his face a landscape of raw emotion. The alpha's hand trembled as it reached out, hovering over their son like he was afraid to touch, afraid to break the spell. Minho, Ji-hoon whispered. Meet your miracle. Minho's composure shattered completely. He gathered them both into his arms with infinite care, his tears falling silently into Ji-hoon's hair as he stared at their child with an expression of such devastating wonder that Ji-hoon's heart ached. He's perfect, Minho breathed. He's absolutely perfect. We made him, Ji-hoon said, exhausted and overwhelmed and happier than he'd ever been. We made something perfect. Minho kissed him then, tender and reverent. Thank you. For him. For staying. For loving me when I didn't deserve it. For everything. Ji-hoon smiled tiredly. You can thank me by handling the first diaper change. Minho's laugh was wet but genuine. Deal. 2 years later, Ji-hoon sat at the kitchen table surrounded by medical textbooks, highlighter in hand, while their son Jywin toddled between the living room and Minho's home office with the determined chaos only a 2-year-old could manage. The penthouse had transformed. Toys scattered across expensive rugs, finger paintings stuck to the refrigerator with magnets, the sterile perfection replaced by the beautiful mess of actual living. Appa! Jywin appeared beside Ji-hoon's chair, holding up a toy truck with great importance. Very nice, baby, Ji-hoon said, accepting the truck and the sticky kiss that came with it. Now go show daddy. Jywin toddled off toward Minho's office, and Ji-hoon watched through the open door as the alpha abandoned his laptop to scoop up their son, spinning him around while Jywin shrieked with laughter. Minho had been working from home more, delegating responsibilities he once would have hoarded, choosing mornings with his family over early board meetings. How's studying? Minho asked, appearing in the doorway with Jywin perched on his hip. Good. Exhausting, but good. Ji-hoon had enrolled in pre-med courses, the dream he'd abandoned at 17 finally within reach. Minho had offered to pay for everything, but they'd compromised. A loan Ji-hoon would pay back, because some things he needed to do himself. Minho crossed to him, pressing a kiss to the top of his head. You're going to be an incredible doctor. And you're going to be late for your video conference, Ji-hoon said, but he was smiling. Let them wait. Minho set Jywin down, and their son immediately grabbed a stuffed animal and began an elaborate story only he understood. The alpha pulled Ji-hoon to his feet, wrapping his arms around him. I love you. I know. Ji-hoon leaned into the embrace. I love you too. They stood there, watching their son play, the city sprawling beyond the windows. This wasn't the life either of them had planned. It wasn't built on contracts or transactions or careful control. It was messy and chaotic, and sometimes terrifying in its vulnerability. It was perfect. Minho's hand found Ji-hoon's, their fingers interlacing with the ease of practice. No regrets. Ji-hoon thought about that desperate night in a hotel room, about positive pregnancy tests and gilded cages, about choosing to stay when leaving would have been easier. He thought about the family they'd built from impossible circumstances, about healing together instead of breaking apart. Not a single one, he said, and meant it with everything he had. Their son laughed, Minho smiled, and Ji-hoon knew. This was what miracles really looked like. Not the impossible pregnancy or the infertile alpha or the one-night stand that changed everything. The miracle was choosing each other, every single day, and building something real from the broken pieces they'd started with.